Greetings, I'm Joan Brzezinski. I'm the Executive Director of the China Center in the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance at the University of Minnesota. I'm so delighted that you could take time to join us today for the 13th annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building Bridges, U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Bob and Kim as they're here with us today. Bob is the founder and CEO of Griffin International Companies, which he formed in 1997. Under his leadership, Griffin International Companies has become one of the country's leading sales and marketing firms with extensive work in Asia and the U.S., with retailers like Best Buy, Target, Walmart, and Apple. Griffin International has been a leading voice in mutual understanding. Bob and Kim's commitment to promoting mutual respect between the two cultures of China and the U.S. and their passion to connect people to China has created a lasting legacy for Minnesota. Throughout these last 12 years, this excellent lecture has welcomed business and government leaders, authors, and scholars. It has promoted the expansion of ideas and dialogue. Thank you, Bob and Kim. Now I'd like to welcome the university's president, President Eric Kaler. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan, and good afternoon, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. And if you haven't had a chance, we have a great logo here, which is a perfect representation of the bridge that we build between these two great and important countries. Welcome also to Ambassador Jon Huntsman, our speaker and guest of honor. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I also want to add my thanks and appreciation to Bob and Kim Griffin. Your generosity has given our community an incredible opportunity to understand, to come together, to learn, and to share great experiences and good outcomes with each other. Thank you so much for what you've done. We also have many distinguished deans, faculty, university leaders, and wonderful corporate and community partners here. And I'm delighted to have from the state of Minnesota, the Commissioner of Higher Education, Larry Poggemiller. Very happy to see you here, Larry. Now, as you have no doubt become aware today, we are extremely proud at the University of Minnesota of our historic 100-year-long bond with China, among the deepest and richest relationships of any American university. And as president, I want that bond to continue and to grow. It is our goal to actively and thoughtfully strengthen the bridges between our nations and our people for the next 100 years. Our work in the years to come will build on meaningful and critical topics that were tackled today, from food safety to medical research, from business relationships to sustainability, and importantly, air quality. Those are among some of the most profound, grand challenges that we as Minnesotans and global citizens face today. And they are the grand challenges, I might add, that fit squarely within the university's emerging strategic plan for the next several years. Now, many of you also know that I had the pleasure to travel to Greater China last summer to kick off this University China 100-year celebration. We met with our Chinese alumni. We have more than 5,000 in China right now, and with our many academic and scientific partners and countless friends. In China, the University of Minnesota is widely known, deeply respected, and frequently sought out as a partner by some of China's most prestigious academic and research institutions. And next month, as a result of that meeting in Beijing last year, I'll return to China as part of a university delegation to work with Chinese scientists and officials to help them tackle their challenging air quality issues. Our meetings will focus on working with Chinese scholars to prevent and control particulate emissions, particularly at the 2.5 micron level, a topic I know that was discussed in a breakout session today. Importantly, we will be the only U.S. university at this important bilateral conference because of the faculty's work, the work of the faculty that you met earlier. They are world leaders in understanding the air quality challenges, and they have continued to develop a special relationship with China. And importantly, we'll also be joined by a large group of Minnesota-based companies, our partners, whose scientists are in many cases our alumni. In the end, our work with China in the future will be built on a deep, deep foundation of strong history, which indeed began 100 years ago. Then, 3 ambitious students found their way from Shanghai to Minneapolis. No Twitter, no Google, no Facebook, 100 years ago. The first to land was Wen Ping Pan, and tonight I want to warmly welcome Larry and Cynthia Pan, the grandchildren of the young man who began to build our first bridge with China in 1913. Larry and Cindy, would you please stand? There they are. So our century of building bridges has in some sense come to a full circle. And thanks to Bob and Kim, we are once again celebrating China and our unique past, even as we march together into a hopeful and productive future. With that, I look forward to our conversation with Ambassador Jon Huntsman, and I'm pleased to welcome to the podium the Director of our Global Programs and Strategies Program at the University of Minnesota, Meredith McQuaid.
Good afternoon. Thank you, President Kaler, both for your remarks this afternoon and for your ongoing support of the university's engagement with China. As Eric mentioned, my name is Meredith McQuaid, and I have the great pleasure of serving as the Associate Vice President and Dean for International Programs for the University of Minnesota System. As Joan has already noted, we are in our 13th year of this wonderful lecture series, and for that we owe our sincere gratitude to Bob and Kim Griffin. For much of 2014, we have celebrated our history with China, and this lecture series has been an important part of that. Looking forward, we know that the Griffin Lecture Series will be an important part of our future, part of our next China century. The lecture series was established to promote and build understanding between U.S. and Chinese cultures, to connect and build appreciation among people, and to provide opportunities to people living on opposite sides of the globe to understand the many things we have in common. These are the principles upon which the Griffin Lecture Series was founded, and they are the principles that will be essential for the continued relationship between the state of Minnesota and the University of Minnesota with China. Today, the university has more than 80 collaborative agreements with 30 different universities in China, and we will build upon those for the future. We currently host more than 2,200 students and scholars from China every year, and we hope to welcome even more in the next 100 years. Our U.S. students participate in more than 15 study abroad and exchange programs to China in growing numbers every year. And with the university's recent pledge to increase our overall study abroad participation by 2019, we will in turn aim to increase the number of university students studying in China. The university is building upon our deep history with China to maintain the existing bridges while also building new ones between the two countries. I'm very excited to hear from Ambassador Huntsman this evening, and I'm sure that he will provide us with advice and guidance to support our vision of an even greater U.S.-China relationship. We have invited the Dean of the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs, Eric Schwartz, to serve as moderator of this evening's event and to introduce our speaker. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Eric Schwartz. He became Dean of the Humphrey School in 2011, following a 25-year career in senior public service positions in government, at the United Nations, and in the philanthropic and non-governmental communities. Prior to his arrival in Minnesota, Dean Schwartz was U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, having been nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2009. Working with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Eric served as the Department of State's principal humanitarian official and managed the State Department policy and programs for U.S. refugee admissions and U.S. international assistance worldwide. Please join me in welcoming Dean Schwartz.
Thank you, Meredith. Before I begin my introduction, I want to mention that At the end of our discussion, we'll be taking questions from the audience, and I believe you've got little pieces of paper and pencils at your seats where you should jot down your questions, and I think there'll be people walking around to pick them up. So we'll look forward to that. I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for the 13th annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridge Lecture. Having served as ambassador to China and Singapore for President Barack Obama and George H.W. Bush, as U.S. Trade Ambassador for President George W. Bush, and lauded for his fiscal policy as two-term governor of Utah, Jon Huntsman offers unusually informed and broad perspective on both global and domestic issues, and on the relationship between the two. As U.S. Trade Ambassador, Ambassador Huntsman launched global trade negotiations and assisted with the accession of China and Taiwan into the World Trade Organization. His commitment to service led to his 2 successful terms as governor of Utah, where in the midst of a national economic recession, Utah earned national accolades for debt management and was ranked #1 nationally in job creation and was named the best managed state, even better than Minnesota, I guess, the best managed state by the Pew Center. On a related note, let me mention that while he may not remember, I guess he did remember because we discovered that this afternoon, I met Ambassador Huntsman in my office in Washington in my capacity as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration when he was serving as ambassador to China following his service as governor of Utah. I was eager to talk to him, not primarily because of his tenure as ambassador to China, but in large measure to thank him for a review of Utah's refugee resettlement program, which he directed, and which resulted in an innovative model of refugee case management that I believed other states would do very well to emulate. Ambassador Huntsman serves as chair of the Atlantic Council, as a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institution, and co-chair of No Labels, a growing citizens movement of Democrats, of Republicans, and everyone in between, and hosts a weekly radio program on Sirius XM, No Labels Radio, with Jon Huntsman. He's also co-chair of the Intellectual Property Commission, which serves at the forefront of developing robust and creative solutions to mitigate the damage of cyber attacks on proprietary networks, reduce the theft of intellectual property in the United States, and enforce policy to decrease future threats from infringing nations. A consummate champion for strengthening America's healthcare system, he is chairman of the Huntsman Cancer Foundation, which serves the needs of cancer patients and their families with research, education, and treatment. So please, join me in welcoming Ambassador Jon Huntsman.
Thank you. Well, when the dean is here, everybody is on best behavior, right? Eric, thank you for those comments. Honored and delighted to be here. 我看有这么多朋友，中国的朋友们在这里，有一半中国人，一半美国人，这样最好。We have half foreign audience, which I would consider myself part of the foreign audience here because I would always term that when I was in China. And we have half friends from China, and that's the best way to begin a bridge building exercise. So this is the right construct to begin with. And to Bob and Kim, we thank you for your goodness, your support, your belief in this cause. And to the university, I have to say, I've been to a lot of university programs focused on China. But I have to say, you are so far out in the lead in terms of what you have done now over 100 years. It's something to take great pride in. Dean, what you've been able to do, Eric and your team, is just absolutely phenomenal. There's much to do, but you've got an incredible head start, and I just want to thank you for that. It's also an awesome opportunity to be at the Hubert Humphrey School, a great statesman. My grandparents used to talk about Hubert Humphrey. He ran for president, something I know a little bit about. He also lost, something I know a little bit about. And things were going really well, not to get into politics, as we were kind of moving up into the New Hampshire primary, and we didn't quite pass the Sheldon-Adelson primary, which put us back slightly. And then we didn't pass the Donald Trump primary. And then a strange thing happened, Eric. This guy named Michael Moore, a well-known liberal in the United States, got on television, and he said, you know, that Huntsman guy, he's actually a Republican I could support one of these days. And I saw Iowa go right down the drain. I thought it was a conspiracy against Huntsman. And not to be outdone, Bill Clinton gets on television and says, that Huntsman guy, he seems like a pretty unhidebound individual. He's actually a Republican I could support one of these days. South Carolina, right down the drain. And that was followed up by the endorsement of the Boston Globe, and then it was all over. And we took it about as far as we could, which was third place in New Hampshire, which is an incredible state in which to campaign. I mean, we did probably, 125 town hall meetings. And you show up in these places, and to my Chinese friends, it's a much different and a more rigorous grind than the way in which leaders are chosen in China. And you show up at these town hall meetings, and you see faces over and over and over again, sometimes 10 and 12 times, and they'll come up after the town hall meeting and say, we're only about 2 or 3 more town hall meetings from my being able to support you. It's a rigorous exercise unlike anything I've ever experienced. But boy, was it a phenomenal experience for our family. I want to leave a few thoughts behind here specific to China, which is a relationship I've tried to crack the code on for at least 35 years, from when I lived back in Taiwan in the late 1970s to living in the region 4 times total. But you feel that the world today is at one of those critical historic junctures. A little bit like 1815 after the Treaty of Paris, a little bit like after 1914 when this program with the Pon family originally was started, a little bit like 1945, the end of World War II, a little bit like 1989, the end of the Cold War. It's a critical breaking point for the United States and the rest of the world. The question really will be, do we wind up like we did post-1945, with a period of growth and some stability? Or is it more of a reckless and unpredictable rise like we saw after 1914? Well, the answer will be in the students who pass through these halls and have access to programs like the one that we are here to celebrate. Because you, over 100 years, going back to 1914, have seen the vicissitudes, the ups and downs, the regularities and irregularities of China, and indeed the U.S.-China relationship. You've seen the very aftermath of the end of the Qing dynasty. You've seen the rise of the Communist Party, 1922-23. You've seen the Japanese invasion, 1932, World War II. You've seen liberation, 1949. You've seen the rise of the People's Republic. You've seen the Great Leap Forward, 1960 to 1964. You've seen the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. You've seen the doors flung open by Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. You've seen Tiananmen Square, 1989. And you've witnessed 30 years of robust economic growth, unprecedented in the world, 8, 9, 10%. And you're here to tell a 100-year story. It's an absolutely extraordinary place for you to be. And now we begin a new chapter. China begins kind of a new chapter. And I say that because we're at the end of the Deng Xiaoping dynasty. We see the rise of the 5th generation of leaders in China. So we've seen Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping being the first leader who wasn't anointed by Deng Xiaoping. Therefore, we have kind of a break in terms of the kind of leaders that China is putting forward. Now, in Xi Jinping, you have an individual soon to be 61 years old in June, comes from the princeling faction of the party, sits atop the standing committee of the Politburo, with not 9 members, but 7 members, including him, all virtually of the same faction of the party, with the exception of Li Keqiang. So will getting things done be a little bit easier for Xi Jinping? Yeah, I think that the bureaucratics of reform and change over the next 2 terms, he'll be in probably 10 years, 8 more years, will be easier than was the case for Hu Jintao, who I would argue had probably 10 lost years, where there wasn't a lot done in the name of reform, part of that likely because of the economic calamities that confronted the world. But here you have the 5th generation, well-schooled, pragmatic, technocratic, far different than the earlier generations. In fact, in my dealings with the 5th generation of China, and I've known at least the 3rd and the 4th and now the 5th generation of leaders within the Chinese bureaucracy. It doesn't matter whether you go in the foreign ministry or the economics ministry or NDRC, you see a level of sophistication that is impressive. You see leaders who have been exposed to the world, in some cases educated at the best schools in the world, impeccable English, an ability to read the United States in a very sophisticated way, in some cases better than we read ourselves, and an ability to see China and its level of newfound responsibilities on the world stage far deeper than we might imagine here in this country. And in this rise of the 5th generation, you have Xi Jinping, who is looking out at this vast country of 1.3 billion people and assessing the challenges that he confronts as he begins to continue his consolidation of power. And I would argue that will play out for another couple of years, and then along will come the 19th Party Congress. Of course, he'll be reappointed. Between the 19th Party Congress and probably the 20th Party Congress, you will see a consolidation of power, which will then allow him the flexibility and freedom to be able to execute on the reforms that he has put forward as recently as the 18th Party Congress, about 2 years ago, and then reiterated at the 3rd plenum this last November. And he goes to work every day into Zhongnanhai, into the White House of Beijing. And he assesses the lay of the land, and he says, we've got a financial problem that we have to deal with. Debt, the 5-tier financial structure between the center and the municipalities is broken, and it's corrupt. And he's got to fix it. And he's putting forward reforms that will change the way in which money passes from center to the locals, the responsibilities that are given to local officials in terms of how they account for that money. He'll have to deal with new debt instruments, expand a bond market that doesn't hardly exist in dealing with newfound debt that could equal as much as 200% of GDP. And he'll look at the People's Bank of China, run by a guy named Zhou Xiaochuan, who's probably the most competent central banker in the world today. And he'll say, well, we can't have the central bank report up through the reporting line through the party. It's got to be independent. We have decisions to make about currency reform and interest rate reform. And you can't do that with the Chinese party getting in the way. So that level of independence is going to have to be achieved, which is not going to be an easy thing for Xi Jinping to do. And then he's going to have to look at the evolving nature of China's population and where they reside, this thing called urbanization. As Wen Jiabao said during President Obama's first trip to China, I remember it well because I was there as U.S. ambassador, would have been back in 2010. And President Obama was going on and on about the challenges that we face here in the United States. There's economics, healthcare, the environment. And Wen Jiabao, as if he had heard enough, said, well, wait a minute. He was premier at the time, before Li Keqiang. He said, how would you like to have this as a problem? How would you like to be a country of 800 million farmers merging into a country where the need is only 200 million farmers? He said, you see, I have 600 million farmers. I'm not quite sure what to do with them. A population that is in flux, and therefore this huge, complex, very expensive issue called urbanization, where you have 150, 200 million people moving from the countryside, the agrarian side of life, into the city centers, where you've got cities like Tianjin and Beijing and Shanghai and Fujian, just to name a few, that are going from 20 million people soon to be 40 million people. And what do you do about infrastructure? What do you do about health care? What do you do about retirement? The old hukou system that allowed people and labor mobility to be able to meet the needs of a growing economy. That's a challenge. And fourth, he's got this wall of resistance called the state-owned enterprises, of which there are maybe 110 major players. And within that, maybe 5 mega players. And today, China has special interest politics. You let it go on for another few years, it's going to look just like the United States. But early on, China had no special interest politics. And today, you've got the large corporate interests, whether it's the oil people, the drillers, the financial folks, the traders, the land developers. And they put pressure on politics like never before in China's history. And Xi Jinping is going to have to stand up to the state-owned enterprises, probably the hardest thing he's going to have to do in the next couple of years, and say, folks, you've written the rules for the last 10 years. Now we're going to go forward with a different set of rules for you. Cost of capital, internal transfer economics will change. Your price of raw materials are fundamentally going to change. You're going to need greater transparency at the governance level. You're going to need boards of directors that actually are responsive to the shareholders. That's going to be a challenging thing for Xi Jinping to do. Is he up for it? My assessment of Xi Jinping is he's probably the most impressive leader on the world stage today. He's someone who has come from politics. He's someone who has come from the hardships of China, going back to the Cultural Revolution. He's someone who has experienced what it means to run a province when he ran Zhejiang and Fujian. So if you were to take out these two provinces that he was governor of, and just on a population and a GDP basis alone, they would rank among the largest countries of the world. He understands something about trade and investment and how you keep a place competitive. But I think the most impressive thing about Xi Jinping is he's been able to bring together, like no one I've seen since Deng Xiaoping, the factions of Chinese politics that are absolutely critical to survive. Now, Hu Jintao, the last guy, wasn't able to do that. He had one or two of the factions that were left out that he wasn't able to connect with, and it made governing China very, very difficult for him. Xi Jinping, on the other hand, is connected with the party. He is the party leader. But what is the party? Well, many of you know. Probably 65 to 70 million members scattered around 3,500 outposts around China. Still, based on the legacy of Deng Xiaoping, the most important organizing body within the country. And he's been able to win over the PLA, People's Liberation Army, the largest standing army in the world. He has some experience. He worked as a personal assistant to former Minister Geng Biao, who was the defense minister in the late 70s and early 1980. He remembers the time that China went to war with Vietnam, which wasn't a happy experience back in 1979. He brings that forward with him now that he's in the hot seat and knows what war can do to a country, particularly after a party Congress when you feel pretty nationalistic. And he's been able to win over the princeling population, number 3, which to my mind is one of the critically important interest groups in Chinese politics to have a relationship with if you're going to survive. So he's been able to bring all of the key power centers in Chinese politics together in ways that no other recent leader has been able to do. He now has a laundry list that becomes fairly challenging, and he's moving forward. And we better understand him, and we better understand his priorities, because there will be no other relationship of the 21st century that will match the importance of the U.S.-China relationship. And here's my concern. And you all are going to have to figure out how to deal with this one, because the students you're educating are going to have to face it head on. And that is when you have a changing global order, as we're witnessing, and something that we experience probably once every 100 years or so. We have another example of a changing world order, with the United States the predominant player, and China bumping up against us economically. China's certain to surpass the United States in sheer volume output over the next 10 or 15 years. Will China catch us in terms of technology and innovation? I don't think so. Will they catch the United States in terms of per capita numbers? Probably not. Will they catch the United States in terms of air quality and livability? Well, that's an open question. But we are experiencing another shift in the global order. And when there is a shift in the global order, there is anxiety. and there is fear, and there is concern. And one of my concerns personally is, how will the United States respond 5, 10, 15 years from now when China really is bumping up against the United States? Will it be a narrative that speaks to opportunity, growth, and progress and bilateral cooperation, as it should be? Or will it be a narrative coming out of the United States that sees China more through a prism of fear and anxiety and uncertainty? One thing I can tell you, one of the truly important headlines at the end of the 21st century will be the rise of China. We know that because it's occurring even as we speak. But the unwritten part of that story is how it ends. And how it ends will be written by students who come through these halls, folks who are just now being introduced to the U.S.-China relationship. They will be part of the policy making and the political machinery that will determine what trajectory the United States and China are able to stay on in the years ahead. Third, let me just say, what will be the challenges in China in getting anything done for Xi Jinping? Well, to begin with, the hurdles are exceedingly high. The expectations among people in China are off the charts high. And I doubt that Xi Jinping will be able to do anything to meet the expectations of all the people. With 700 million internet users, with 100 million bloggers, with access to the outside world like never before, the pressure's on, and Xi Jinping knows it. He's probably the first truly savvy technocrat who wakes up in the morning and can read the blogs, he can read the Weibo, read the Twitter sphere, and follow what the next generation is saying. I'm not sure that anybody part of the last generation of leadership was able to do that. And he's going to have to deal with issues that are being put out there in the forefront, like income inequality, which, if not dealt with, could be a disastrous issue longer term for China. He's going to have to deal with pollution, which I'm glad to hear, Eric, that you're taking up here in some of your breakout sessions, because this too is becoming a political issue that some are organizing around. We used to have a fancy device on the top of the U.S. Embassy in China, and we would take the measure of PM 2.5 every day. It was an EPA standard monitor. And we would tweet it out, and I'd get called in by the foreign ministry. And they'd say, Mr. Ambassador, your numbers are all wrong. They can't be right because our numbers are much lower. You see, you're out there by the second or third ring road, and you get all the exhaust pollutants, and our numbers are right, yours are wrong. Well, come to find that just this last year, China has embraced EPA standards for the way in which they measure emissions, which is, I think, a step in the right direction. It tells me that the people are moving this issue forward in ways that is then incentivizing the government and the party to begin to take action. Second challenge will be, how do you coexist in a neighborhood that is in flux? So we take for granted in the United States the fact that we have the two most impenetrable borders in the world. We have the Atlantic Ocean, we have the Pacific Ocean, we have Canada to the north. We're not going to go to war with Canada anytime soon. We have a pretty good trading relationship with Mexico. China wakes up, and they're surrounded by 14 or 15 nation states, some of which they've gone to war with in recent generations. Soviet Union, Amur River crisis, India 1962, Vietnam 1979. It's hard to know what's going to pop in this difficult and challenging neighborhood. And then Xi Jinping looks across the way at Japan and sees the rise of Abe-san, Shinzo Abe, a nationalist and someone who carries a bit of history, a bit of family, a bit of sovereignty dispute. And Shinzo Abe looks across to South Korea, now run by President Park, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who ran the country between 1961 until his assassination in 1971. And she looks north to North Korea and doesn't know what to make of Kim Jong-un. And I say that region, Northeast Asia, because half of U.S. trade goes right up through the East China Sea and across through the Pacific. Is this region critical to our long-term economic survival? Of course it is. Are the events that play out and the political atmosphere in which the economies grow important to long-term U.S. interests? Of course it is. It's absolutely critical. Finally, let me just say that the one big issue to watch play out, among all of the other challenges that Xi Jinping has on his plate as he continues his consolidation of power and picking his priorities will be, can China make the transition from the 30-year-old investment-led export machine to now a consumption model? Because China has reached the middle income trap. If China doesn't expand commerce and move people up the income ladder, it'll be stuck for years to come, which is an unacceptable outcome in a country that can't afford to have high unemployment, because when there's high unemployment, there's a potential for social instability. So key to making all of this happen will be the reforms that we've touched on briefly, but it will also be convincing the average citizen of China, and we have some of you here who are lucky enough to study at this school, that now is the time to take the renminbi out from under the mattress and invest it into the future of your country, where that hasn't always been the norm. There's a very high savings rate in China, not so high here in the United States. Why is it high? Because it seems that every 20 years or so there's been a bit of upheaval or instability or foreign incursions without that sense of confidence that we can see into the future and we're going to be okay. So the challenge for Xi Jinping will be, how do you articulate a future for China that builds confidence, that builds trust, that builds a sense of a confident direction, such that citizens will begin taking out their hard-earned dollars and investing it in their future. And in order to get there, there've got to be the social safety net issues that give people the confidence that they'll have a retirement program because the iron rice bowl no longer survives, that health care will somehow be fixed, particularly bad in rural China, where you've got at least 700 million people living, that the hukou system is going to be reformed from where it is today to maybe more of a regional approach. The challenges are many. But let me just say, when you look to the next 100 years, your work will be important, but demographics will shift and change our priorities at some point. So when you all wake up in 100 years and take a look at the world, we're not going to look kind of like we do today, because the PIN code of the world today is 1114, meaning that of the planet's 7 billion people, roughly 1 billion live in Europe, 1 billion in the Americas, 1 billion in Africa, and 4 billion in Asia. And right around the bend, by 2050, Asia will be up another 1 billion to probably 5 billion total, but then it's going to stop because the birth rates will begin to fall. By then, Africa's population will have doubled from 1 billion to probably 2 billion people. Europe and America, the Americas, will stay roughly the same. And by 2100, when we'll all come back and review the state of this program, the world's PIN code is not going to be 1114 any longer, but rather 1145, with the global population peaking at about 11 billion people, 4 billion living in Africa, 5 billion living in Asia. And by that time, the main maritime thoroughfare of the world will not be the Pacific Ocean, which we are talking about, but rather the Indian Ocean, because that will be the waterway linking 9 billion of the world's 11 billion people. So 100 years from now, if you were looking for a good long-term investment, may I recommend some beachfront property in Sri Lanka? Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll talk for a few minutes, and then I think we'll take questions and comments. And I do want to get, thank you for fascinating comments, as well as your kind words about the breadth of the commitment of this university to engagement with China. And I really have to feel compelled to say that while your words about Hubert Humphrey and the Humphrey School will always be welcomed by me, we are just participants in a university-wide effort that is led by President Kaler, by Meredith and Joan, and so many others, and very happy to be participants in that engagement effort with China. When I worked in the State Department, appreciated in a way that I never really did before, that the United States was a superpower when we had a crisis. There was a crisis in Nepal. And I called the State Department and I said, I need some information on the crisis in Nepal. And they said, well, let me connect you to the Nepal Working Group. And I said to myself, well, you know, if the U.S. government establishes a working group for a crisis in a place so very far away, you know, that means that a crisis anywhere in the world is a crisis of concern to our government. When you speak about China's ascension, my question is, does the Chinese leadership have ambitions for that kind of role? Should they have ambitions for that kind of role? And what should be our posture, the posture of the United States and the international community about such a role? Because there's well,
I think you have to start with the premise that China's rise is inevitable. And facilitating and supporting its rise in ways that integrate it with norms and standards for trade and transparency and international responsibility and human rights and things like that should all be part of the dialogue. But they're playing the long game. So the biggest cultural difference when you're dealing with China, as I did on the ground as ambassador, and as I did as a trade ambassador before that, is you have on the Chinese side of the table the best long-term strategic thinkers in the world. And on the American side, I would argue, the best short-term tactical thinkers in the world. And you have a chasm that is created between both worldviews. And the challenge for this next generation will be, how do you bridge that? How do we think a little bit more the way China thinks and see the world as they see it? And how does China begin to deal with the American view of the world in ways where we can develop policies and we can develop collaborative programs with both of us on the world stage that will leave the world more prosperous and more peaceful? This will be the challenge, but China's rise is inevitable. I always used to think it a bit of an oxymoron when I'd hear China's leaders talk about the peaceful rise, because peaceful rise is in and of itself not possible in many cases. When you rise, you're going to create a certain level of anxiety, particularly within your immediate neighborhood. But China is developing an economic model that is integrating with the rest of the world, a political model where, if not modernized, will become an anachronism, which could be a very dangerous thing if it happens sooner rather than later, where China wasn't prepared for that. And I think China is beginning, as I've seen in just the recent years, is beginning to understand what it means to be a leader on the world stage. So forever, China was willing to draft behind the United States as if in NASCAR racing. You know, you draft behind the car in front, you don't take the wind, and you have an easier go at it. Well, China has been willing to draft behind the United States for a long time. Now they've ascended to the world stage, and they're being asked to sit at the table of world decision makers, which is a new thing for China. And in the years to come, so I just finished writing, I was asked by Time magazine to write an essay on Xi Jinping, which will appear next week in the Global 100 Most Powerful People. And I suspect Xi Jinping will be among the most powerful in the world. But I basically say in my essay that he will be the first global leader, in the sense that he will be the first Chinese leader to sit at the world table and expected to deal on issues that really matter, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa and health issues, whether it's stability in the Middle East, whether it's North Korea and denuclearization of the peninsula, whether it's economics and market opening measure. All of these things will be new for China. They won't be easy, and they won't come naturally, but they will be an inevitable part of China's rise. And we should encourage and we should facilitate while doing what America does best. We have certain values and interests that are part of our heritage and upbringing. We shouldn't shy away from those. But we should also find a bridge, a level of collaboration on issues where the United States and China have common ground. Because where we have failed in recent years, we do a very good job of pointing out our differences. Everybody knows what they are, and they shout at us through the headlines in the paper every day. But we haven't done an adequate job in defining that which brings us together. How do you clean up the air? How do you find cures for cancer? How do you deal with global issues where one of us might be inadequate, but together we can do it so much better? We're not yet able to deal with the reality of both of us sitting and problem solving on global issues. But I think that's about to change.
had a different question, but your final sentence, you think that's about to change, is intriguing. So let me follow up on that statement. In what ways? And your comment suggests that there are particular events or issues that come to your mind when you say that.
I would argue that unlike in earlier generations, we are so inexorably tied economically through investment, through trade, which is only going to explode in the years to come. We're going to see more Chinese investment here. We're going to see more exports to China as China's currency begins to take on more of a market orientation. There will be no option other than to figure out how we can sit together and make the situation work. And what I'm also encouraged by is the rise of a generation in China that sees the world a little differently, that understands the United States maybe for what it is. In Xi Jinping, you have somebody who actually lived in Iowa for a brief period of time. Is he a China expert? No, but he has some flavor for who we are as people. And in the next generation coming up in the United States, I'd say the millennials. I know something about the millennials because I'm raising 7 of them. They've had some opportunities to interact with China through programs like yours. Study abroad programs, language study, which didn't exist when I was in school, even though I did it at one of the few programs at the time. And I think that's going to result in a greater understanding between us and therefore the global responsibility that both of us share.
So if I can tack back to my first question, and as we get questions from the audience, we'll move away from geopolitics, but you always got to tack to your area of knowledge and understanding. In terms of this issue of the Chinese self-perception of their role in the world and the region, do you imagine that there are conversations going on among the Chinese leadership right now with respect to the public diplomacy surrounding their regional territorial claims? And if you're a Chinese, I guess I'm asking you to put yourself in the shoes of the Chinese leadership in terms of the question that I asked, the role, your role as a regional and world leader versus your interest in those particular islands, if you will.
If I'm Xi Jinping sitting in the middle of Zhongnanhai, I'm saying, what can I do? What are my policy options in keeping my people supportive of my reform agenda? I'm embarking upon an anti-corruption campaign that has everybody scared. I'm capturing the attention of the party elite because of what I'm doing. I can't lose their faith and confidence in what I, as their new leader, am endeavoring to do. I say I have the economic lever, which I can pull, which may be the reason why their currency is moving in a counterintuitive direction, maybe to stimulate more exports shorter term and goose GDP performance. And the other is how you treat certain neighbors in the region, like Japan. There's nothing like that lever of nationalism that begins to stoke up support for what it is you're trying to do. So I think some of this is rhetorical, and some of this is an attempt to consolidate power, because you have to take a harder line with the PLA, for example, that wants to hear, just as in American politics, that red meat conversation. I heard something about that during the primary of the presidential campaign. Where's the red meat? Well, as one of my friends in the Standing Committee of the Politburo in China used to tell me, 我们中国也有政治. In China, we have politics too. So let's not discount the extent to which Xi Jinping is trying to play to his base. But at the end of the day, here's what Xi Jinping needs to survive. He needs tranquility at home, and he needs peace abroad. So the words will fly, and they'll get pretty heated and pretty sharp, and the ships will make the rounds of the Diaoyu or the Spratly Islands, and we'll see deployments in the South China Sea around the Spratlys and the Paracels. But in the end, he can't afford to go to war. He doesn't want to go to war. How can you take that which has been built over 30 years and destroy it? He knows the costs of war. He's seen it just in a very short period of time with Vietnam when he worked for Minister Gung Biao. He does not want his legacy to be that of a destroyed economy and a region in turmoil. So I think in his own head, he knows where those red lines are, and he's not going to cross them. You have in the East China Sea island dispute, an old issue. This is not new. This has been around for a while. In some cases, these have been around since 1895. And so the question will be going forward, how do you manage the hostility between the players? And that will be an exercise in diplomacy, and one in which the United States can also play an active role.
Terrific. You made some very interesting comments about the domestic challenges confronting the Chinese leadership and the need to be responsive in the way that an American politician would need to be responsive. As you say, there's politics in China too. But tell us what the Chinese political system looks like 10 years from now. And how do you see it evolving?
I'm not sure that in the political system itself you have a lot of change in terms of what the structure looks like. I think you have a Leninist system. You have a standing committee, a Politburo, and a central committee. 7 people, 25 people, 370 people. And you have a National People's Congress, which they will argue is the representative and responsive body of the people. I don't know that you have a change in that. What I think you see is a change in civil society. I think you see an expansion in non-government organizations, so to speak. So I had an interesting, I lectured up at one of your competitor institutions in Boston not long ago. And in the classroom was a young lady from China. And I asked her what she did. She said, well, I run an environmental NGO. And I'm trying to bring greater awareness to the environment. I said, where are you located? She said, well, I'm hidden within a university right now because I can't be anywhere else. I can't be out on Chang'an Street. I can't be on the main street. And I said, I'll bet in the next 10 to 15 years, you will have an address on Chang'an Street. And I think that is likely what we will see evolve with greater confidence, with Xi solidifying a power base, with the economy correcting itself, and with some of the structural barriers addressed, some of the debt paid down, maybe neighborhood peace and stability. I think the next big thing in China will be how to expand civil society, how to give a little more freedom and more of a voice to people who want to speak out about the issues without bringing down the system. It will be a very slow, incremental approach, but I think you will see progress. And I think that will be a very interesting journey that we'll likely see over the next 10 years.
Thank you, John. I have, sticking to my schedule, and I was told that at 5 after 6 I go to these questions. So that gives me license for one more geopolitical question, and then we'll get to the cards, where there may also be geopolitical questions. Talk to us about your perspective on the president's, and the administration's articulated pivot, such as it was, to Asia, and also in light of the perspective and perception that among many of China's neighbors, the U.S. presence in the region is largely seen as a benign presence. Maybe not as much by China, but by other governments in the region. I think we'd all be interested in your perspectives on both the pivot and the role of the United States in the region.
Well, we've been bogged down in the Middle East for 12 years plus. And now, I think for good reasons, we're beginning to see that our future will be across the Pacific Ocean. That's where the largest trading partners, largest economies, and the growing militaries will be. It's where our trade flows will be, where our job creation opportunities will likely reside. So I think the philosophy behind it is right, but the substance and the execution were both flawed. So in order to have a successful rebalance or a pivot geographically, you have to have two things. You have to have content, right? You have to have substance in the security sphere, in the economic sphere, and in the diplomatic sphere. And I would say that, as articulated 2 years ago, the pivot or the rebalance was devoid of at least two of the three. Long on security and very short on diplomatic and economic vision. And the second part is it's really important to consult with the region before you embark on such a major grand strategy announcement. And there was very little in the way of consultations undertaken. So what happens in that vacuum when there isn't the diplomatic consultation? People assume the worst. They assume that your intentions are to hem in, to contain, to engage in a stronger than what you might have anticipated security approach to being on China's doorstep. In any event, there wasn't enough of the strategy articulated to our allies and friends and others in the region. So here we are trying to catch up, and the president in recent years has been consumed with Syria, with Libya, with the withdrawal from Iraq, and this year from Afghanistan, without the focus and attention on the Asia-Pacific region. So I would say the intent is honorable, and from a strategy standpoint, it's about time that we do it. But from a content and a consultation standpoint, we're a bit behind and we need to up our game.
So we'll move to the questions now, if that's okay. Thank you.
Sure.
The first question, what was the hardest thing you had to do as ambassador, and what surprised you as ambassador?
The hardest thing was probably to coordinate the American interagency policymaking process around American priorities in China. So you imagine you have the largest, the busiest thoroughfare in diplomacy, which is the U.S.-China relationship, in which you have cars speeding down the highway at 100 miles an hour, and there's no strategy to it. And you sit there at the table, you say, okay, we have to do a couple of things really well to make the relationship work. And that's going to take focus and coordination and a proper narrative that can be taken to the American people and to the folks in the region. Trying to coordinate that aspect with a Congress that doesn't do China, with an administration that, and any administration, I've seen them built up over several administrations, where the interagency process is downright impossible to get anything coordinated, was probably the most difficult thing of all. Surprised? I was surprised at, and though I shouldn't have been, at how good our American public servants are who work out at the U.S. Embassy. So if you want to know where the best and the brightest Americans go, well, they don't always go to Wall Street. they don't always go to hedge funds and stuff like that. If you go knock on the door, which is impossible to do, by the way, at the embassy in Beijing, you will find the most talented men and women who have dedicated their lives to some pursuit of security, economics, intelligence, military, whatever it is, and they are good, and they are dedicated, and they are patriotic. And if I could have taken what I saw every day in buildings that, few people can enter, if I could take a snapshot of that and broadcast it to the American people, they would have been proud of where their tax dollars are going for the most part. I shouldn't have been surprised because I'd run an embassy before in Southeast Asia, then went back in the business world. But it really was a reaffirmation of the kinds of people who we attract into the professional corps, the Foreign Service, and many other aspects of public service. And I hope that continues, and I hope in this very school you promote that to the best of your ability.
Your former colleague, Tom Nides, the Deputy Secretary of State, was a strong supporter of this university. He's from Duluth, Tom is, and he made exactly the same. He's made exactly the same point. He's from the investment community. He's at Morgan Stanley now, but as a government official, made the exact same point. The other thought I had from your comment, you were the former governor of Utah. There is a interview in this month's New Republic with Rahm Emanuel, in which he talks about the difference in being able to get things done when you're a governor versus when you're in a federal administration. And I imagine it was a little easier as governor of Utah.
Well, I had all the leverage.
Well, that's right.
You're a team player when you're an ambassador, with a big team on the field and a lot of plays in the playbook that aren't necessarily well lubricated. As governor, you get to be the dictator.
That's right. How would you? How would you comment on the recent anti-corruption efforts by Chinese leaders? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I'd have to say that I'm overwhelmed at what I have seen. When you talk about a run-of-the-mill anti-corruption drive, you think about a run-of-the-mill anti-corruption drive. But when Xi Jinping said that he was going to go after the tigers and the flies, I don't think many people thought that Zhou Yongkang would be part of it, who, while I was in China, he had the 9th seat on the standing committee of the Politburo, He ran the Ministry of State Security and the Ministry of Public Security, and as such was the most powerful man in the country, I think more so than Hu Jintao at the time. To think that he could be taken up along with his family, his relatives, his business acquaintances, taken up in this dragnet of anti-corruption led by a guy named Wang Qishan, who's a member of the Standing Committee as well, who's probably one of the more impressive people I've ever dealt with, is well beyond what anybody would have imagined. And the names that have been sort of floated, even in the rumor mill, of people who are on the target list would suggest to me that Xi Jinping, even cautioned by Jiang Zemin, who still is a major player in the firmament of party activists and leaders, to not go so aggressively. I think two things are at play. One, I think, in a sense, Xi Jinping wants to clear the decks so he can repopulate some of these positions with his folks. He's got to consolidate power. This is a pretty slick way to consolidate power. But two, he knows that there is a level of frustration, anger, and animus pent up in the population of China as it relates to corruption. It's the deal. And he has to prove to the people of China that he's not only serious about it, but he can show some results. And I think he will take this to an extent beyond anything that we might have predicted or forecast. Will it do the trick in terms of convincing people that he is rooting out probably the most insidious cancer in the country? That's hard to know. But I do think it's going to build greater trust in him as a leader, and therefore play back into his ability to actually execute on his reform agenda between the 19th and the 20th Party Congresses.
You've addressed this next question broadly, but maybe we can ask you to kind of bear down get it maybe a little bit more into the weeds on this. What would be your advice to the next ambassador to China?
Well, I sat with Max Baucus a few times, including recently at my home, where he came by, and I said, Max, draw from your strengths. So he's been chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He's had some oversight role for the S&ED, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. He understands financial matters. He oversees all trade policy in that position as chair of the Finance Committee. So draw on your strengths. Don't try to do something that isn't part of your background or your wheelhouse. Get the bilateral investment treaty done, which will languish otherwise. That could be the most important deliverable between the United States and China. China wants it, the United States should want it, and it's good for economic growth between us. Focus on market opening measures. Focus on how to facilitate China's investment here in the United States. Do the things that you know well and can really play a role in. And that will be the most challenging thing for him. And I go back to my initial comment. How do you make some sense out of the most complicated relationship in the world today? And how do you bring it down to size so that you can actually get a few things done? So I think if he sticks to the economic side of the house, and then finally, I said, you know, you'd be foolish if you didn't use your relationships on Capitol Hill to open doors with Congress, where we don't have anyone anymore who even takes an active interest in China. No one. I've tried to find the people on Capitol Hill who, like the Daniel Patrick Moynahans of generations gone by, actually take an active interest in the subject matter. Come to find, it doesn't pay political dividends to do China. And I found that to be the case when I ran for president. It's easy to say what you're going to do to China, and you get an applause line at every town hall meeting. It's really difficult to say what you're going to do with China in terms of a long-term strategy, which is our future. That's where the conversation needs to go. So to the extent that he can rally some support on Capitol Hill and reintroduce both groups, China's party leadership with some of our members of Congress, that will be a really big deal. And I hope that that's one of his key priorities. I suspect it will be.
This raises, I need to ask you, I think I need to ask you a question about the issue of human rights and human rights diplomacy. I'm not sure exactly how to frame the question, because I think it's largely accepted that human rights are important in American foreign policy, and given the rise of China and the range of issues that we have at stake with China, there are other issues that also come to the fore, and that the human rights issue, while an important one, is not the only issue in our bilateral relationship with the Chinese. And so, but I want to get beyond that, and I want to ask you, I guess, what would you offer to Senator Baucus on this issue? If he said to you, John, how do I handle the human rights issue, both with respect to the Congress, but also in terms of what we're trying to achieve with respect to China?
I gave this one a lot of thought. And some action in China to the point where my name was actually banned from the internet at one point in China, which I didn't quite know how to take. But so when you talk about human rights in China, you know, the translation into Chinese is 人权, which is human empowerment. And every time we'd have a visiting dignitary come to China, and I'd hear the translation, I'd think, okay, for 5,000 years, we've had no human empowerment. You know, we talk about it as if everyone's a Jeffersonian Democrat, and just the transition in thinking is a really tough thing to do when you look at empowering an individual over a community, when you've had 5,000 years of an emperor, you know, who's pretty much the sole person in charge. You know, some have said they don't count heads. You know, traditionally in the old emperors, they would lop off your head if you didn't obey. And so the transition then to human rights, we can talk about it, and we should, because that's a fundamental value of the United States. But it's to the point where we talk past each other. And U.S. officials basically check the box so they can go back and say to the press that, oh, we brought up human rights, and, you know, we did what needed to be done. We have to have something fundamentally better and deeper and more substantive than just the traditional human rights conversation. I've always thought that focus on rule of law and legal reform, which is very important to China's future. And the leadership is even talking about legal reform. Now, why legal reform? Because I think legal reform, when taken as you start with just the economic and commercial realm, which is where the leadership would like to see it focused, ultimately is going to seep into civil and individual liberties. Inevitably, it will have to. And with that, as I say, the rise of the civil society players, and I think it will evolve over time into something far more substantive than what you have today, which I think ultimately allows for a broader conversation than on human rights. You have a framework in which you can actually have that conversation. So I have advocated with some of the top law schools in the country to band together and to think about how we can leverage our strengths as a bulwark of rule of law, a nation committed to the rule of law, and somehow begin to develop collaborative relationships, not just the dialogues every year, where we speak and they speak, we speak, they speak, and then we have a nice dinner and leave, but actually engage in some sort of capacity building with universities, with NGOs, with state-owned enterprises. And I say that because it's one of these, you know, 互相帮忙,互相学习,共同进步, you know, in the Chinese aphorism. If we work together and study together, we'll make some progress. I say that because this is an issue that we have an interest in, but China does too, because they know inevitably they're going to have to constitute some framework for rule of law. And that, to my mind, would be a very important bit of progress.
This conversation is very relevant to this institution. We have upwards of 2,500, as Meredith said, Chinese students here, many, if not most of whom, will be going back to China, many of whom have expressed deep interest in rule of law and human rights issues and are reflecting on how they can play a productive role in their country of origin. So this conversation is a really important one, and it's one that is really ongoing, I think, here. And here's an appropriate follow-up to the question I just asked. I am curious about the narrative of just getting China on board with the United States. You noted China's adoption of EPA air standards. Can you give some examples of when the U.S. and the world have adopted Chinese standards?
Well, I'll give you one good example. I adopted Chinese standards in my public schools as governor for Chinese language study. We became the most progressive, most ambitious state in America when it came to Mandarin language study. How to do it? We brought in Chinese students, we affiliated with Hanban, and we rewrote the curriculum for dual immersion and language learning. And I thought that was probably one of the most important contributions that I could make as governor to the next generation. We couldn't have done it without certain institutions in China, without learning from their methods of getting it done. Important to the state I ran as governor, but every other state in America, because it will be through language that you're able to better understand China and its history and its culture and its traditions. I'd say without knowledge of language, you're limited in terms of what you can really do in terms of developing an understanding of that relationship. I thought the greatest gift I could give the next generation of students, and we'll have 25,000 students this next year in Utah who will be part of a Mandarin language program. Elementary school kids. The best gift that we could give them is a head start on Mandarin language study. They don't have to become fluent, but what it will do in terms of allowing them to better understand another part of the world, I think, will be priceless.
At the risk of being accused of asking you the same question I just asked you, but this may be a little bit different. What is the biggest lesson we can learn from China and its people?
I think the biggest lesson, at least one of them for me, was respect for education and respect for teachers in society. Now, there's something about being a leisure, a teacher. When you jiao shu, when you teach curriculum. My grandfather was a teacher, and a public school teacher, and he thought the highest rung possible was that of being an educator, lao shi. And we've lost that tradition of putting teachers on a pedestal, educators on a pedestal. And with that, I think the importance of, or the centrality of education in the home and in the community, and what it gives to the next generation. China hasn't lost that for the most part. They still put teachers on a pedestal. If you're a lao shi, you're somebody special. And education still plays a central role in everything they do. And I think there's a lot there that the United States can learn from and emulate that would probably make us a better, stronger country in that regard.
Given the issues you raised, by the way, these are great questions. I haven't seen the ones that have been screened out, but the ones that were screened in are terrific. Given, and I can take a few more if you've got, given the issues you raised, how do you think universities in the United States and China should engage with each other perhaps in ways that they haven't engaged heretofore? Thanks.
What does China want in higher education? They would like research universities like this one. They would like strong medical, bio sciences, health sciences, translational research. How you take innovation from the bench to the marketplace. This is what China would like to see done. So why is it that when you look at a little bit of the cyber poking, if you disaggregate all of the cyber intrusions on our side, that there's a lot that happens on higher ed campuses, research university campuses. There's a keen level of interest in how you build a research university. So we've gone through the last few years of collaboration. I can name, along with this great institution, 5 or 10 others in the United States that have really worked to build collaborative partnerships in terms of just institution building, taking a big part of their programmatic excellence and rebuilding it, transferring it to China. That's good, but now comes the hard part. Now comes, what do you do with it all? What do you do with the academic excellence, with the programmatic excellence, with the firepower, the raw material that we have created? What do you do in terms of cleaning up our act on the environmental side? How do you take programs and actually take them to fruition? How do you deal in health sciences with basic disease, where if you combine the laboratories of the United States and China, and great universities between the United States and China, we'll get to the end point twice as fast. I have no doubt about that. But we have some walls that exist. There are bureaucratic walls, there are cultural walls, there are institutional walls, and we need to break them down. And there are no better places in which to show signs of progress in issues that are good for everybody, just building human talent and human capacity, than at the higher ed level. That's where all of our leverage is, if you were to ask me. A lot of the other issues we talk about are problematic at some level, but with higher ed, it's all good. It's all positive. There's all upside. So now that we've spent some years institution and capacity building, I would say find some programmatic areas and set some benchmarks, some waypoints, as they would say in aviation, that will allow us to kind of forward the ball in environmental sciences. What do you do about, air quality in China? What do you do about issues like climate change? What do you do about air that's put in, emissions put in the air? Where I sat in Los Angeles last week, and the former governor told me 10% of the emissions come across the Pacific Ocean and are dumped right on our doorstep in California. We're all downstream, so why not begin to work towards solutions? So there's so many areas that, A, could improve the plight of humankind, and B, could strengthen the U.S.-China relationship in the process.
I want to ask you a question that I think, well, I'll just ask it. Does, your work with No Labels, which is designed to bridge differences between political parties, enhance the civility, presumably, of the political dialogue, does that have benefits to the U.S.-China relationship as well?
Well, to the extent that it gets us looking at the world more realistically. So what are we trying to do at No Labels? We've had the most dysfunctional Congress since the post-Civil War period. Nothing. Not that you want Congress to do a lot or screw up a lot, but you need a few things like a budget every now and again, for the largest economy in the world. So now we wake up to a world that's, team blue and team red, and, Republican, Democrat, Fox News and MSNBC, and the whole middle's been blown out. And you got 70% of America saying, what about me? What about good, sane, rational policy making that just gets us to the end point? We just don't do that anymore. We're trying to recreate enough synergy within the Congress. And we've got 100 Republicans and Democrats, an equal number now, who are meeting every week and grinding away at some good solutions on issues that will really matter to this country longer term. But it will allow us to see the world, I think, in realistic terms. Right now we're pandering to the extremes, because that's what the marketplace, that's where it takes us. That's where the money can be raised, that's where you get on the TV shows, but it's not where anything gets done. So if we succeed over the next 2 to 3 years in creating an environment that rewards problem solving and actually getting things done as opposed to just baseless rhetoric, then I think that will maybe have an impact on the way in which Congress sees the world and America's role in the world, and maybe even a dialogue or two about rational, practical policies that must exist between the United States and China. The years ahead are going to be fraught with complications and challenges. That's a certainty. And I fear that if we don't have a steady hand on the tiller, members of Congress and beyond, who see the relationship for what it is and are able to kind of pick and choose between good policies, that we begin to see China through the fear factor, the fear prism, as opposed to the opportunity prism. The play for us over the next 100 years will be to see the U.S.-China relationship through the opportunity prism. Despite our differences, despite our challenges, we have a lot more that unites us than divides us, and we can only hope that we've got the right people, your students, who begin to take the roles and responsibilities of leadership and are able to put some pragmatic sense of the world to the test.
That's worth an applause, absolutely. And as you were talking about our students, I had the same thought, and I've discussed this with a number of our faculty over the last couple of years I've been here, which is that our students today, they're a lot smarter than I was when I was a graduate student, and I think that offers a lot of hope for the future. But in terms of the challenges, what do you think the biggest, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding or misunderstandings that Chinese leaders have about the United States, and what are the implications of those misunderstandings? Probably that the United States is bound and determined to hem in China
and to contain its rise. I think there are many who actually believe that to be the case. Of course, you have to have a diplomatic strategy in the region, but the United States, and I think most people in America, want to see a peaceful rise of China. Want to see, as we began this discussion, they want to see a peaceful rise in China taking a seat of leadership at the table of responsible global leaders. And there are some leaders who actually, I think, are convinced that the United States is purposefully trying to hem in the country and contain its rise and ensure its defeat, where I don't think that's representative at all of where China or where American policymakers are or where the American public is.
The next question, I think the answer to this question, you'll agree, is no. But the reason I'm going to ask it is because it reflects a kind of a series of questions which will get you beyond no. So the question is, to bridge the communist and hypermarket systems, will China have to and be able to adopt a Scandinavian social welfare type system? So you see why, but you see why I'm asking the question.
No.
Well, let me put the question a different way. You alluded to social welfare demands within China, I guess maybe what I inferred from this question is, how far will the Chinese government have to go in terms of addressing issues of social welfare, of social democracy, if you will?
As far as they need to go to preserve domestic stability. So 100 years from now, I think you have a set of circumstances that look far different than they are today. You can't have a party that is locked up behind closed doors, lacking in basic transparency, not always responsive to the people. You can't have over 1 billion people living in an economy growing at 7, 8, 9%, which can't sustain that growth in the future, particularly as you transition to a consumption model, without adequate retirement and social safety net issues. You'll have havoc that will be destabilizing domestically. There is a reason that Deng Xiaoping went to Singapore back in the 80s, a very important trip, where he visited, and he basically, in certain words, said, this is a model that we can relate to. And now, to the China watchers of the world, many of whom have forgotten that incident, I think that was a very instructive example. Deng Xiaoping was thinking ahead beyond party politics as he opened the doors diplomatically and opened the doors economically to China. And that is, how do we navigate the system into something that looks a little different in terms of our representative government, our governance structure, the role of government in government-linked corporations, minimizing the role of opposition political parties, and being a powerhouse from an economic standpoint. I think they see in Singapore, maybe primarily because it's 75% Han, and they can look at a model that is managed and driven by a majority Chinese population. You don't want to look to, Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia for an example. You're going to look to Singapore. You're even going to look to Taiwan on certain days when you can see across the strait. And my guess is that 50 to 100 years from now, you begin to see an evolution that looks a little more like the Singapore model might have been in the 70s or the 80s.
I'm looking at my master, and I think we have time for 2 quick questions. And good. And the first one is, nationalism is on the rise, not only in China, but in the United States, in U.S. ally Japan as well. How can the United States ease tensions while safeguarding its interests in the region?
I would say political nationalism is on the rise because political dysfunction is on the rise, and trust toward government is the lowest it's been ever. So what do you do in response to that? You stoke up nationalist sentiment. You know, you go to the extreme end in terms of your party rhetoric and your party platform. So Japan, with 25, 30 years of stagnation, 11 or 12 years of deflation, a country going from 120 million to probably 90 million, aging population, still severe structural impediments in terms of their own economy. How do you change that dynamic and get people believing in themselves again? We have the rise of Shinzo Abe, who embarks upon a program called Abenomics, in which he discounts his currency, he fires up exports, he gets a new bloc in the upper house of the Diet elected in support of him, but not enough to change the Constitution, and you give a new sense of direction in life to the country, which is what he has done. And what do you do in China when you have a sense of insecurity about the economy, about the transition that is going on from the rural communities to now the urban communities, pre-internet to internet society? I mean, the whole society has changed. And with that tremendous uncertainty, well, you rally people by the kind of language that is being used by Xi Jinping. I think this is not too atypical in the early days, even the early years of a transition into a new administration. What will be interesting to see is where the language and where the rhetoric goes beyond 2014 into 2015 and 2016 with both Japan and China. You can only go on so long barking at each other, sending your ships out around the islands, pretending like you're on the brink of war, stoking up support for your policy program. I say you can only take that for so long because you're each other's largest trading partner. That didn't exist in earlier generations. You could afford to go to war. You could afford to engage in kinetic conflict because there was nothing to lose. Well, you have everything to lose today. So at some point, you're going to have to put the pieces back together again. And as soon as Xi Jinping feels he has the confidence, as soon as Shinzo Abe feels he has the confidence, they'll begin to engage again. That might be a year or two from now, but I think that's an inevitable part of the whole economic evolution of the region.
And the question asked about the U.S. role, and I take it from your answer or I infer from your answer that the U.S. role here is going to be a modest one.
In the region?
No, in terms of this particular issue, the issue of nationalism.
I think we will see our role primarily in the region as it relates to those two key players as being a reliable backstop, as being an honest broker. So the key around the islands will be not that you're going to find a solution anytime soon, because there isn't a solution. Right. China's not going to give an inch, and Japan is not going to give an inch. So you go nowhere. So the key to all of this will be, how do you engage in a conversation that says, all right, life must go on. We must begin to build confidence in the region. We must begin to determine how you use these waters for transportation, for military exercises, for natural resources, for fishing. And we're going to have to agree on some template as we go forward. So I think what you see the United States do is to encourage that kind of confidence building in the region that I think we can do. China doesn't like it. They always think that we have a sinister motive, particularly given our alliance with Japan. But I think that's likely where you see America's role in this somewhat nationalistic debate going in Northeast Asia.
Ambassador Huntsman, I have one more question, and I should say that in Minnesota, we're not supposed to go over the time allotted for an event.
But you've got permission, right, from Meredith.
But we're only 5 minutes over, and the last question I think is really appropriate for a university, and it's certainly appropriate for a public affairs school dean to be asking you. So maybe I'll implore you to keep your answer short so I don't get in trouble later. But in any event, for anyone interested in entering diplomacy as a career, what would be some advice you would give that you wish someone would have given to you?
Well, I didn't get the advice because I was serendipitously dropped in a region of the world as a late teenager and had to learn a language and a culture and life on the ground. But I would say, and as I watched the people operating within this large 2,000-person embassy, the real impact was made by those who really had a deep knowledge of a particular issue set. So you can become a generalist, or you can become a specialist. And what I think we need more of are people who are well-trained in certain aspects of economics, and certain aspects of our security relationships, and certain aspects of our soft power, the cultural dynamic. And to the extent that you can tie that all up with a language, I think is indispensable. So if you can walk out of here with a decent fluency around a language and a real sophisticated knowledge of an issue set, and you want to pursue diplomacy or military work, whatever. I have 2 boys in the Navy. They've chosen to go a different route. You know, everybody does different from their parents. You know, they didn't want to be diplomats. They wanted to go out and do something different. But I think that would be an enormous head start. And you would never regret those decisions that you made while at such an outstanding institution. Maximize the time here, be mentored by the best, and become a specialist in a certain issue set. Thank you. Thank you.
On behalf of the China Center and the Global Program Strategy Alliance, University of Minnesota, I would like to thank Ambassador Huntsman for his lecture and discussion tonight. It's been really informative and very interesting, and thank you to Dean Schwartz for your very able and careful guidance through this conversation. Thanks so very much. I'd like to invite Bob Griffin to come to the stage and present our award.
Ambassador Huntsman, we've come to know you as a great governor, obviously, great ambassador, unbelievable policymaker, and obviously an incredible father as well. But tonight I think we all would agree that you've been a very passionate and powerful speaker tonight on U.S.-China relations, and we're very grateful to have you here. So thank you very much. I appreciate it very much. Do a little something. Thank you so much.
So this will conclude our afternoon, our discussion today. Thank you very, very much for coming. We hope to see you again next year.